thanks for everyone for being here, both physically and in cyberspace. My name's Brian Woodall, and I guess we'll introduce each other as we go. This is, well, Muriel, please.
Yeah, so I'm Professor Muriel Horowitz, also a professor here in the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs.
And we're here to talk today about a research project we've been working on for, some of us for 2 years, others of us at least a year, or a year and a half, or for others. It's on megaregions and sustainability. What I'll do is quickly provide an outline of what we're going to talk about. We'll introduce the team. We have 5 members of the research team, the student members, and we have, of course, Dr. Horowitz and myself. I'll talk a bit about megaregions and sustainability in the global north, talk about the project, and then the students will take over. And this is our team. I'm the one in the middle of the front. And I'll let the students introduce themselves as they come up. But we are a multidisciplinary team. We have students from international affairs, computing, ISYE, aeronautical engineering, and we have another professor pictured on the bottom of this list of team members on the right, second from the right, Carrie Watkins from civil engineering. So this is our team. And what I'll talk about is just how we got started. And our start point was looking at megaregions and sustainability in the global north. In interest of full disclosure, this project started with kind of a Japanese focus. That's what I do, interested in megaregions in Japan, and there are arguably 2, but we'll get into the reasons for wondering about that in a minute. So that's where it started. Began looking at the Boston-Washington, called Bos-Wash. The Boston-Washington corridor is the second one to compare. And then we added the Amsterdam-Brussels-Antwerp triangle in Europe to sort of bring it out to 3. The reason for looking at the global north, a lot of it has to do with data availability, and we also wanted to have an apples-to-apples comparison. So we're looking at 3 megaregions in the wealthy part of the global north, as it were, in 3 different cultural and institutional settings. So, and again, there's a richness of data. You can see from the satellite photos, part of that reflected in the ability to sort of get a clear fix on the megaregions. So the Boston-Washington megaregion, this is the very first one that was ever noticed or written about in the literature. And students can correct me. John Gottman was published 1957. Anyone remember the exact date? Okay. John Gottman, I believe a city planner or sociologist, noticed that there was this uninterrupted, sort of continuously populated area that stretched all the way from Boston down to Washington. So he called it, I don't remember if he called it the Bos-Wash himself, but others did. He called it America's Main Street. So this was a densely populated area of the Northeast, continuously populated. It bridged multiple municipal boundaries, local boundaries of different types, state boundaries, and obviously it embraced a massive population, a number of cities. Here's a graphic that kind of spells this out a little bit more clearly. A population today in excess of 50 million people, about 18% of the total in the U.S. Hugely important in terms of economic output. Land area is also big. You can see the data there. The other point to make about megaregions is not only are they where lots of people meet and live, they work there. And so it's an important unit of production. There are also places where innovations come from. There are many reasons to study megaregions, and so the Boston-Washington or the Bos-Wash megaregion is America's most famous and its biggest. The greater Tokyo megaregion, when we started this project, I thought this would be an easy one because it's quite discrete. And those of you who've been to Tokyo know that you can go up to the top of any tall building, but let's say the Tokyo Metropolitan Government Building and look out, and it stretches on forever. It's really clear that it's a megaregion in the sense that you're seeing well beyond the boundaries of Tokyo City into different prefectures and different areas. But I thought, wow, this is an easy one. Wrong. We'll see why in a minute. 38 million people in Tokyo proper. the greater Tokyo. This too embraces a number of different, or bridges a number of different municipal boundaries, textual boundaries, and obviously it encompasses a great land, a huge land area. Is very important in the Japanese context, and I'll let the students, when we get into the next portion of this presentation, describe the mapping issues with Tokyo and the fact that it might not just be one megaregion, it might be one that's connected to another, the Keihanshin megaregion, southwest of Japan. And then we added Amsterdam, Brussels, and Antwerp, not confined to Benelux. It's actually, this one is tricky. Almost the entirety of this portion of Western Europe is arguably a megaregion. But we focused on this one. It's been noticed by people like Richard Ford and others, so it came up there. It too embraces a huge population, 60 million people. That's 14% of the EU population, but the population of that sector of Western Europe is much higher, of course. A big land area, again, high per capita incomes, very densely populated. So those are our megaregions. The choice of them was based upon this idea of wanting to compare apples to apples. The next phase of the project that we're just about to undertake will look at the global south. A lot of issues there. We'll talk a little bit about that today. But again, we're comparing apples to apples, looking at these three megaregions of the global north and trying to figure out, and one of the issues that we came to is how do you define a megaregion? How do you map a megaregion? It's not that easy to do. And so that's why why Dr. Borowitz joined this project to bring satellite data in. And so what I'll do is I'll turn it over to the students, and please introduce yourselves as you present.
Hi everyone, my name is Gavin Rolls. I am a third-year computer science major, undergraduate student here at Tech. I came onto the project in about February of this past year when we were wrapping up a lot of the primary literature review portion of this particular study. So we had a handful of key questions that we were looking to answer when we performed this literature review. Thinking about our megaregions, Bos-Wash, Greater Tokyo, and Ambrust, we wanted to see if our conceptualization of these regions was reflected in the literature, and if there was consensus within the literature to these regions as megaregions. Of course, the logical follow-up question to that is, okay, if Bos-Wash does exist, what are the particular aspects of its boundaries? What does it really look like? And while certainly most scholars do agree that Boston, New York Washington, D.C. and New York are part of Bos-Wash, some of the boundaries of Bos-Wash and even Boston itself can be somewhat disputed. So we wanted to analyze places where there was dissent as to the boundaries of these particular megaregions. We also wanted to investigate to what extent efforts had actually been made within these regions to form coherent bonds between different parts of the region, if there were efforts being made to kind of realize these megaregions in certain senses. So for our literature review, we used the keyword megaregion to identify 500 papers from Google Scholar, as well as 109 papers from the Web of Science. There were actually thousands of papers that came up in Google Scholar, but we found that the relevance of these papers started to dip off quite a bit before 500. So we found 500 to be relatively representative of relevant papers on megaregions. From there, we took the papers that we had identified and then classified them by how they actually went about defining megaregions. Some papers would use the term megaregion kind of offhand and wouldn't necessarily dive into the specifics of how they were using that word or what they meant when they used that word, whereas other papers took a stab at actually defining this term. So we wanted to isolate the papers that were actually trying to define the word megaregion and provide some specificity on how they use megaregion. And from that, we identified that papers generally defined megaregion by way of one of three key approaches. And those are the approaches that we're going to take a lot of time to talk about today, because they are, in many ways, the focus of our study on megaregions. Those, broadly speaking, are interdependent systems, where we look at relationships between cities in terms of their shared infrastructure or institutions. Nodal Linkages, which will focus more on transportation linkages between cities or urban areas within a megaregion. And then lastly, satellite data, where we use light emissions data as a proxy for population centers and economic development. First things first, we'll dive into interdependent systems.
I'm Daisy. I'm a fourth-year industrial engineering major, minoring in global development. I'll be going over the interdependent systems approach. This is the first one out of the three that we'll be talking about today, and it's the largest in terms of like the number of papers that fall into this camp, and also the broadest conceptually because there's just so many factors and components to take into consideration. It's definitely not as specific and narrow as the other two. But looking at the foundation of the interdependent systems approach, it's based on systems theory. So we're looking at the notion of mutual dependence between individual municipalities in the study of megaregions. So with the system, it's made up of structures and functions. So structures are groups of units that come together to perform specific tasks or functions. So in the context of a megaregion, the system would be the megaregion, and then the structures would be the individual urban and rural areas that collectively work together to perform functions. So that would be to control governance, facilitate policymaking, or control economic output as well. And then going into the characteristics of this approach, there's four main attributes to define or to describe interdependence within the megaregion. And these four attributes are used in the definitions of the megaregion in all the literature that fall under this camp. So the first one is convergence, which is pretty self-explanatory. It's just describing how neighboring areas come together over time to form one continuous region as a result of population growth. The second attribute is collaboration. So urban and rural areas are working together primarily to facilitate economic output. So looking at how they attract goods and services and also share common markets for labor. The third one is common ties. So that's describing the common interests that different areas have in common with each other. And so the most common types of relationships that are actually used in defining a megaregion with this approach, they're economic, environmental, infrastructural, cultural, and historical ties. And then the fourth one is polycentricity. So that's the most complex attribute of the four. It's looking at mutual collaboration over centralized governance. So there's this diffusion of resources and functions from heavily concentrated urban centers to more rural cities and towns. And so there's this division of labor that's formed where we have a bunch of different cities and towns that are specialized in specific resources, and that forms a mutual dependence on each other for those specific functions. And then I'll pass it on to Maria to go over advantages and disadvantages.
Hello everyone, I'm Maria Winstead. I actually most recently joined the project at the beginning of this semester, and I'm a master's student in international security. So in terms of some of the advantages of the interdependent systems approach, it's unique in the fact that it allows for researchers to account for culturally relative, historical, economic, environmental, and infrastructural factors that the other approaches aren't able to account for. Because also the diverse nature of the approach, it is widely applicable for economic and political use and is useful in allowing researchers to sort of form the approach as best fits their research needs. So in terms of disadvantages, the clear big disadvantage with the interdependent systems approach is that it's somewhat ambiguous. So with this megaregions, there's unclear boundaries, and it's difficult to map exactly where a megaregion lies. So there have been some, cases where there's the opportunity to show kind of a blurred line of where megaregions lie, but in terms of more clear exact boundaries, it's difficult to map. And then during our research, we also found that many scholars were unable to provide empirical data to answer specific questions about these megaregions, and then with that, how to define them.
Hi, I'm Jessica. I'm a fourth-year industrial and systems engineering student with a minor in international affairs. And I'll kind of get into the approach of the nodal linkages. So nodal linkages essentially is trying to define a megaregion through identifying the urban nodes and the transportation infrastructure linkages between those nodes. So some of those linkages might include highways, roads, train systems, and public transportation systems, as well as the commuter flows and the consumer good flows on those infrastructural linkages. So some of the advantages of this approach is that there's a clear core and the border decisions are not needed. So if we look at this map of Europe, this is the Antwerp megaregion, which, as said before, is Amsterdam, Brussels, and Antwerp. And while it's very difficult to see where the exact border is, it's very clear to see that there is a concentration of urban nodes and transportation linkages within this region itself. There's a very densely packed system, and so that is one of the main advantages of this approach. Another advantage is that there are very global applications. So especially within the global north, it's not really a question of are there urban nodes and are there transportation linkages? That's kind of a given fact. So even though those linkages might look very different between different megaregions and different regions of the world, this approach is very ubiquitous and easily applicable across the globe. So say in the Bos-Wash region, there might be more cars on, roads and highways, and in Europe and Japan, more so train systems and public transportation. But the fact remains that there are definitely linkages between nodes, and we can clearly see where those nodal linkages really form into megaregions. And another advantage is that it's very useful. This approach is very useful for examining existing infrastructure and infrastructural policy. So if we look at this, again, map of Europe, we can see that the very main train lines and the main airports. And so with this approach, if we know where concentrations of people and urban centers are, we can examine the existing infrastructure or create new policy that helps make these regions more efficient in terms of economic output, or facilitate, quality of life, improving the means for people and goods to transport and travel throughout a region easily. However, some of the disadvantages are that it's difficult to map the exact bounds. As seen before, sometimes the boundaries can be very murky, especially because linkages, transportation linkages specifically, don't just end or start at the edge of a megaregion. They normally just taper off in terms of concentration. So it might be very difficult to be like, here is the boundary, but the core is very easily seen. And another disadvantage, specifically, and especially, in the global south, is that sometimes it's very difficult to know, to have internal data. So as mentioned before, a main component of this camp is to see the commuter flows and the flow of goods through a megaregion, while in the global south, sometimes it's very difficult to access that data and have, have access to it. Yeah.
And I'll follow up with the final approach that we investigated. This satellite data approach is actually the one that was really interesting to me, what encouraged me to come onto the project, because I think it's a really unique way about thinking about urban studies and urban regions. In addition, it's perhaps the most well-defined of the approaches in that the way in which it maps regions is very much distinct from shared infrastructure institutions. So our methodology for defining megaregions by way of satellite data was by taking NASA's DMSP and VERS data sets, which are their light emissions data sets, and thinking about that in terms of being able to map individuals to city regions based on their light signatures from space. So what we did is we first just took the raw data and set a certain threshold for what we thought was viable to be considered part of a megaregion and then wouldn't be considered part of a megaregion in terms of light emissions. So certainly brighter spots would be indicative of higher population density or urban centers, whereas if there isn't a lot of light emissions, certainly you wouldn't necessarily want to incorporate that into your megaregion because that would indicate a lack of population density. From there, we drew boundaries based on that threshold, and then just made some minor modifications to make sure it wouldn't necessarily span over into the ocean. In addition, we applied population data sets to then try to identify the particular populations of each region that we had found using our light emissions data set. For the most part, this was pretty good in terms of being able to identify urban regions. There were a handful of things that threw it off, which is why we needed to incorporate population. In particular, shale fields actually have a really big light signature, but certainly that isn't necessarily indicative of a population center, so we had to account for that, and we used population data to make that happen. So you can see this is an example of Western Europe, the raw light emissions data, and then what that looks like mapped over the political boundaries. Satellite data is really useful because it's not necessarily concerned with municipal or even national boundaries. For a long time, the way megaregions were identified was making judgment calls on specific, in the US, counties or abroad, other kind of subdivisions. So Gottman, in his original study of Boston, Washington, was making calls on individual counties, saying, is this county a part of Bos-Wash, or should this county be excluded? And certainly that means that you're kind of forced into using pre-existing municipality or county guidelines. And certainly the satellite data approach breaks free of all of that because we're just using light emissions, and light emissions don't care where your political boundaries are. And certainly that's also very helpful when thinking about megaregions that will span international boundaries. Our example with Toronto, Buffalo, and Rochester is perhaps not as worrying given that Canada and the US are relatively similar. But for other megaregions, it can become quite contentious to think about how a connected region might span across the international boundary, and satellite data removes some of the ambiguity of that. In addition, we're applying the same standard in terms of our data across the globe, so we don't have to worry about making certain adjustments for certain countries. So as you can see, as we dive in the future into megaregions and their existence in the global south, this method is still very much applicable in those parts of the world. In addition, our calls on what is and isn't a megaregion and then what the boundaries of those particular megaregions look like aren't up for debate. They're not subjective choices we're making because this approach is very much data-driven. We have particular reasons for including and excluding certain parts of the world when it comes to defining the boundaries of megaregions. It's very unambiguous as to why we've drawn boundaries the way we have. You can see here what the light emissions data looks like when you're just applying that specific mask or boundary for whether or not light emissions is considered viable to be considered part of a megaregion or not. And you can see that makes it very clear what areas are just small towns that happen to have some light emissions versus what is actually a kind of greater area or large megaregion that spans multiple states. You can see Bos-Wash really shows in that image there. In addition, before we move on, we don't actually have a slide for it, but there is one key disadvantage to talk about when it comes to satellite data. I've kind of alluded to this threshold that we have to define. When we talk about light emissions data, we need to decide what level of light emissions is sufficient to be considered a megaregion and what level of light emissions should be excluded. And the justification for establishing that threshold can be muddied at times. Sometimes it's left as a judgment call to particular researchers who are using the satellite data method, and that can become then difficult to understand why researchers set that threshold where they did, and it will drastically change the boundaries of the megaregions you ultimately identify.
Hello everyone, this is Yuji Takabo, and I'm a third-year aerospace international student, and I'm actually from Tokyo, so that's the biggest motivation. Like, I'm joining this project, and from now, like, this is what we playing like so far is just a one part of like our research project, and I would like to explain like how Megaregion sustainability project objective like been working for, and like our future research direction as well. So there are four key components like we're proposing here. And first of all, we are writing a conference paper, and also we are hoping like we could submit to a journal as well. But like we are trying to like complete a literature review paper, which basically like explains like how we define megaregions as we explained here, and also we also analyze 3 or 4 cases of like actual application of megaregion using these defining methods. Which is like global north megaregions, which is Greater Tokyo, and European megaregions, and also the East Coast Bos-Wash area. And each megaregion has like each like sub questions. For example, in the Greater Tokyo, whether we should include Tokyo, whether we should include like Osaka, Keihanshin area into the global global megaregion in the Tokyo megaregion as well. And also talking about like the global south, which is also the fourth application of like this project objective, which we'll talking later. And second of all, we also like trying to find the external like collaborators, because this project is like really international, and not only Georgia Tech knowledge, but like also we are looking for like local specific knowledge. Because defining megaregion is merely a first step of like tackling like what we actually want to solve, which is tackling to the local issue or like administrative issue using the knowledge of like global megaregion. So we are trying to we are looking for like other collaborators, and so that we can specifically tackle on so many issues around the world, such as protection of transportation, food security, and energy infrastructure. We didn't mention here, but like also the protection of disaster, natural disaster, such as like earthquake, or even including COVID-19, which is kind of a hot topic right now, or those kind of stuff as well. Third of all, we would like to explore a megaregion of the global south. Currently, in the literature review, we mentioned this in the paper, but there are very, very few references for the global south megaregions. While, as like we presented in the previous slide of like satellite data, there are quite a few like potential candidates for like global south, and we need to like look into like those regions in more detail, so that by combining like other methodology as well, we could figure out like what would be like in the megaregion in the global south, and like how different are they compared to the global north, and like what kind of issue they have locally. So finally, the fourth point is like explore emerging megaregion in global north, Piedmont Atlantic region. This is like unique to Georgia Tech research team, but like we are trying to connect with like Piedmont Atlantic region and we are regarding like this is like emerging megaregion. And we are planning to like throw another like workshop in Georgia Tech, or maybe like Piedmont Atlantic region next semester, so that we can like further like get an understanding of like not only the global like megaregion style, but like also or local megaregion style. That's it for today's like presentation. And we if there's any question, it's like more than welcome. So thanks for listening.
Do you want to work this?
How do you want to do it?
First of all, just let me say thank you to the students. Bright, articulate. This is a very good group. Obviously reviewed hundreds of different works in literature, categorized them into those three camps. It's been a pleasure to work with these guys, and you can see why. So we're happy to take questions. I'll ask the students to kind of help out when it gets to their, we kind of divided this up into different camps and different approaches. That's kind of how we've done it. So we have camp experts sitting right here who can come and answer the specific questions, but we're happy to answer whatever questions you might have. And let me just say one thing that I should have said at the outset. This is a project that's intentionally comparative, and we're interested in sustainability. We want to understand what the requisites of sustainability are in the different megaregions and try and find best practices. So is Bos-Wash doing better on protecting, for example, transportation infrastructure than Tokyo or Ambrostorp and that sort of thing. So that's where we're headed in the future. We've been lucky to get funded. We had a DLOC grant through the Ivan Allen College to kind of get the project started, and now we have a Georgia Tech seed grant. Been very fortunate, and we're out looking for even bigger forms of funding. But anyway, questions? Happy to answer them.
I've two questions. One's kind of probably an easy and quick one, another maybe not so much. The Piedmont Atlantic area, where exactly is that? Are we talking Atlanta, Nashville? Is it kind of that area? Or I don't know.
That's a really good question. And in the literature, some people refer to a Piedmont Atlantic megaregion. It goes from roughly somewhere in Virginia all the way down to roughly Atlanta.
Okay.
If you look at the satellite data,
like Charlotte.
Okay, so it's certainly the Research Triangle of North Carolina, down to Charlotte, through that, I don't know what they call that sector of South Carolina, all the way down here to Atlanta.
Okay.
So that's the Piedmont Atlantic megaregion.
Gotcha.
What we're going to do in the spring is convene a stakeholder workshop of stakeholders across the region. bring them in, hopefully be able to share with them some things we learned about megaregions from our work on the global north and eventually on the global south, but see where things stand within the region. How is it viewed as a region? What happens if a huge tropical storm, affects some part of it? Is the megaregion the scale at which we should be dealing with these sorts of things? So we might get a solution.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I was just curious. I was assuming that, I didn't know if it was going northeast or is it going kind of more up, towards Tennessee, but I was just curious. My second question, and you addressed it at the very end, was for me, like this threshold, right? If you're going to use that satellite method, it seems like that threshold is the crux of, because as you dial up that threshold or dial it back, right, your range just kind of, so I guess from what you saw in the literature, because at the end of the day, it seems like there's a threshold that people are reaching, all in agreement, right? Like there's this core, but like how did they get to that threshold? What did you see in the literature where they said, okay, I'm using this much lumens and this much square miles, and this is why I decided to do that?
We've actually been really frustrated by this because sometimes it's difficult to tell why these calls were made. The language that is consistently used in papers who have defined a threshold when they talk about it is something along the lines of, we set this threshold thus so that the megaregions that resulted from our method were consistent with existing conceptualizations of megaregions.
Yeah.
I don't love that language. I think we kind of agreed that that's a little wish-washy in terms of actually making a call on why a specific threshold was chosen. And in fact, I think one of our future directions is we're looking into how we can use aspects of the nodal linkages or interdependent systems approach to ultimately come to an informed conclusion on what threshold we might want to pick.
Okay.
Well, and even to add on to that, one of the big people who's written on this topic is Richard Florida, who was mentioned earlier, using the satellite data, and he actually does not provide his specific cutoff. So he does not provide any numerical, this is the cutoff we use. Mm-hmm. And so you have, in trying to recreate what he had done, you have to kind of go through the process and try to figure it out. And then also in his work, not only does they not give, this is our algorithm, this is the cutoff point, but they say, there were cases where there were these, thin connections between two megaregions, and so sometimes we just cut them into two. And so there was that element as well. And so, that's kind of one of the things Gavin was saying in his presentation, his piece of the presentation is, at first glance, and in some ways, the satellite data is very, non-arbitrary, right? Like you have this cutoff, those are the borders, that's it. Right. But in practice, the way it's been used in the past, that's not quite true, right? You don't necessarily know exactly what the cutoff is or why. And other people have made adjustments even after those boundaries were drawn. Okay. Right? Based, again, on kind of judgment calls. And so that's one of the things, one of the ways we originally got into this process of, well, how do you really define these things was because of that. We were trying to recreate these boundaries with the satellite data. Mm-hmm. We had to figure out what the cutoff should be ourselves. So really trying to think through that logic. And then understanding, is this two elements that really should be tied together? Should you be cutting these apart? How do you make that call? So in the end, when they're talking about, well, let's also bring in nodal linkages, let's also bring in these other ways of defining it, that's how you can make those judgment calls in a better way.
That's right.
Bringing in more data.
That's right. Yeah, I completely agree. It's incorporating those other methods, and it sharpens that ability to say, okay, this is my threshold, and then because of these nodal linkages and because of the kind of the other methods, it just makes it more robust. So yeah, interesting.
Can I add a little bit? So I think me personally think the important factor of factor data, we have quantitative data compared to other two methods. And not only we can draw through a line, but for example if we have number for each pixel, we can even draw gradient element. We might be able to draw some mountain in the shape of map. So that we necessarily don't have to draw a clear line, but based along with each topic we want to tackle, we might be able to collect different megaregion a boundary even for the same megaregion. Mm-hmm. And also not only for the night light data, we can also tackle with other data such as emissions CO2 or the temperature or other data. And in that sense application of satellite data is really unique and broad. While we also feel there are not so many researches have been done So that would be that we in that sense, like we think like those kind of like direction is like really like interesting approach in research.
Cool, very good. Thank you.
And we can do it over time. So the satellite data is available back to the 80s. Is that what it is, more or less?
Yeah, it's like
76, I think.
76, it depends, which, like the global coverage varies and things like that, but yeah. And do you want to introduce yourself also, if you'd like to ask questions?
Yes, I'm sorry. My name is Mike Chechi. I'm a PhD student here at the San Bernardino School of International Affairs. I'm in my second year, and I actually had a class with Professor Woodall, comparative politics. So I kind of wanted to see just what this project was all about and just kind of a little bit of the methodology behind it. Very interesting. Yeah.
Thanks for the question. Josh Jones. Anything else?
Hi, I'm Reagan. I'm a master's student in the International Affairs program, and I kind of had two questions. I was wondering what you all are hoping the implications of your research will be, and I was also wondering, even though you had started on the global south portion of the project, what differences you think you might find between global south and global north regions?
I'll start, and the students can fill in the many blanks that will be left. Locations, you mean the mega regions we're going to focus on? Is that what you're saying, or where the partners we're looking for there?
The implications, she's saying.
Oh, the implications.
Implications.
Oh, the implications. One thing is, as far as I know, nobody's really tackled the sort of issue of sustainability of megaregions. Talk a lot about them. Richard Florida is one of the pioneers when it comes to this subject. He's published a lot. He's more of a salesman type. He'll sell the megaregions. Really important because it's this economic dynamo. It concentrates all kinds of people and creative people in a relatively small area. But there's no kind of concern for the sustainability piece of it. And they're around the world. They're huge urban areas that are becoming bigger all the time. And yet nobody's really stopped to take a look to see how sustainable they are. The megaregions are not necessarily run the same way in different places, so we're trying to find that out. That would be one implication. Others? Yeah.
To your question about the global south, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're interested in what kinds of challenges we face in terms of applying these methodologies in the global south, or?
No, I was kind of wondering what kind of differences you think you might find between global south and global north megaregions?
I think one of the key things is the fact that infrastructural development is a lot more limited there. So even though you have, from a traditional perspective, really densely populated areas or areas that are very much contiguous in terms of where people are living, that isn't necessarily reflected in live emissions or in shared infrastructure and institutions because a lot of the things are just a lot weaker there. So I think it challenges kind of our traditional conceptualization of megaregion when you think about what that looks like in the global south. And papers in the past have called them different things. I think one paper referred to megaregion in the global south as development corridor, something like that. So it's been addressed a little differently in literature, but that said, there hasn't been a whole lot of work that has looked into what megaregions look like in the global south. They've kind of been pushed aside as something like a development corridor.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be an element of exploratory research there. There's very little. I mean, it's almost like you would think there just aren't megaregions. And part of the question when we looked at it is, are there megaregions in the global south? Because there's so little written about them, particularly outside. Like we found some in China, the people have said some stuff, but Africa, South America, there's some very large, densely populated areas where there's clusters of cities that seem like they could be, but there's almost nothing written about them. And so that kind of question of, are they megaregions? In what sense? That it matters. How are you defining megaregion, right? That comes to bear again. And then once you say, yeah, they do fit the definition of a megaregion, trying to understand, how are they different? How are they evolving? Is it just are things that are fundamentally different? Is it just like an earlier version of some of the more developed northern megaregions? I think those are all open questions in my mind. And Brian, you've been doing research in this for a longer period of time, but I think I'm really excited about that piece of our future research because there is so little done in that area. So I think that's really, we don't have a good answer for you yet, but I think it's, to be continued. So hopefully our next talk will tell you some interesting stuff on that.
We anticipate data issues. I mean, the global north is much richer in data. That's a fact. We are, I guess in a word, kind of the spearhead of a much bigger team. So with the Georgia Tech Sea Grant, we've expanded the team, and that's one of the things we're going to do is going to look at the global south as part of that. We have several members of the team who know a great deal about Africa, so I think we might pick a megaregion in Africa and focus on that. We still haven't decided, to be honest. And in 2 weeks' time, we're actually going to have, we meet mostly every week. We're going to have Catherine Ross, a professor in city planning and civil engineering, come speak to us on the 17th. She's, in the literature, and the students can correct me if I'm wrong, she's one of the giants of this field, and we're hoping to sort of tap into her wisdom as to how to proceed, but global south is going to be a challenge. I think it's incredibly interesting and important, but very little work's been done on it. Most of what there is deals with China, which is a middle income country, and already I wonder whether it's still in the global south. So, good questions. I hope we did an enough job of answering them.
Actually, I have one from the online audience. This is from Quentin Gaddy. He asks, what aspects of working towards / achieving sustainable goals through regional collaboration in megaregions could have transferability to microregions? Are there any innovative governance models that have emerged that could be scaled down?
I'll say hi to Quentin for me. He's a former student.
You can say hi.
Oh, hey, Quentin. Wow, that's a hard question. We have any insights from the literature that would help to answer that one, to scale down? I mean, what's being done at the megaregional level? We're just now trying to figure that out ourselves, and we're probably not in a position to give a clear answer even on that. And what there is being done at the megaregional level to sort of manage a militating against a natural disaster or COVID or whatever, we're kind of the pioneers in trying to figure that out. So I don't know if we have a clear answer. And so to scale it down, anything from the literature that might help answer that I hope we write this question down, because that's one we want to follow up on, that question.
I don't know about, not necessarily from the literature, but I remember an example you gave, Professor Woodall, about approaches to COVID-19. I think it was maybe New York and Boston that kind of shared, had kind of a coordinated approach and how to handle COVID-19. I guess just kind of further understanding, how do we understand why they decided to coordinate and maybe why they didn't, expand that coordination to other cities. It's just kind of an interesting.
Excellent. And in the Northeast, the governors, there's some cooperation there, so we could call that an institution that's starting to evolve. Yeah.
Yeah, this might be off the mark a little bit, but when I think about kind of regional governance, perhaps at a smaller scale, the example that comes to mind historically would be something like Greater London, which used to be kind of a city in its own right and was surrounded by home counties that managed their own affairs. And then in the 1960s, they made a lot of changes to the way London was governed, where a regional council would handle a lot of the kind of region-wide affairs, things like transportation and disaster response. And then other matters would be delegated to local boroughs in London. I think that, I don't know if this is quite addressing the question at hand, but it seems to me like that kind of model might have potential on a multitude of different scales, thinking about delegating perhaps more local responsibilities to local institutions, but still having some level of regional governance for issues that really impact the whole region or have to be made at that scale.
The other thing we could consider is how we might scale up some of these smaller sub-megaregions, scale them up to the full megaregion scale. So, anyway, thanks for the question. That was terrific. Excellent. Anything else? Yes.
I know this, I'm Stephen Ash, fourth year International Affairs. I know this was kind of touched on in trying to decide how exactly to go about defining a megaregion, but do you think it's possible from your preliminary research to have a megaregion without strong transportation linkages? Like in the US, they directly follow interstate corridors, I-85, I-95, depending on which megaregion we're looking at in the east. And it seems like they generally do for the rest of the global north. But the global south and these developmental corridors, are those just following new transportation linkages there?
No, I was just thinking.
Oh, no, yeah, so if I'm not entirely sure I understand your question correctly, so you're saying in the global south, how are we going to define with transportation and nodal linkages?
Pretty much.
Okay, yeah, so that is one of the challenges that we've been running into in the global south. So that's also a next step we want to take is how can we change sort of elements of our definition to be able to fit the global south, if that makes sense. So in the nodal linkages camp, that would be trying to define what might be considered transportational infrastructure, if that makes sense. In the sense that in the global north, that's like roads, highways, train systems, and public transportation that are very clearly defined and obviously also very clearly like accessible. Something I forgot to mention, sorry, was one of the global applications of this methodology is, or at least the nodal linkages methodology, is that it's very easy to find in the global north where these linkages are, or on Google Maps or other similar platforms. But in the global south, sometimes those roads might be dirt roads that are not like, technically a road, or like just there might just be one train line, but they branch off into many different areas. So that is one of the challenges that we're trying to look into and see how we can change that definition up a little bit to be able to better fit the global south. Yeah.
No, you just had me thinking. One thing that I think we see a lot in some of the global south megaregions, we haven't done too much studying, but we did take the satellite methodology that we put together and apply it to parts of the global south, is that oftentimes those regions will follow like large rivers or be pretty consistent with river deltas, which might be indicative of the fact that either that's just the settlement pattern that exists there, or that those rivers are actually being used as transportation arteries in their own right. I think the best example is probably Egypt. Certainly, there's no one off the Nile Delta, but the Nile Delta itself is very densely populated. Granted, I don't know if you could attribute that to transportation along the Nile. It just seems like that's how people have settled. But it is kind of an interesting demonstration of perhaps more atypical transportation systems.
Great question. Thank you. Else? Okay. Apparently we are. Thanks to everyone who came in person. Thanks to those who joined online. Thanks for the questions. They're terrific. Have given us plenty of food for thought. And I want to thank the students. An excellent job. Rachel disappointed us. You're in the nick of time. But they worked really hard. Obviously, they did the lion's share of the work in plowing through hundreds of sources. It's actually a much bigger kind of literature than I had thought when we started this project. But I think we've taken the most ambitious approach just to reviewing the literature, and we've been able to condense from it those three approaches. And now we want to use that methodology we come up with to come up hopefully a clear definition. We don't know if we can apply it globally or not, because the difference between the global north and global south raises some issues. But we have a great team, and we've done, I think, some good things. And I thank the students, I thank Dr. Borges, and I thank Chris for putting this thing on for us. And thank everyone for your attention.
And there's